A poor rancher and his horse got a broken saloon, but what they found in the basement shocked everyone. The town laughs when the penniless rancher buys a ruined saloon. Its roof caving in, windows shattered, dust swirling through the door. He thought he bought a wreck. But when a floorboard cracks beneath his horse's hoof, a hidden trapdoor opens, down in the dark. He doesn't find bottles or gold. He finds a terrified Apache child, living alone where no one dared to help her. And beside her, a locked chest, filled with secrets, land deeds, water rights, and the truth the sheriff and the railroad men will kill to bury. The church bell tolls, the jail keys rattle hooves, thunder in the night as fire consumes the saloon. The law calls it a crime. The townsfolk call it a curse. But for one broken man and a girl who's lost everything, it just might be a second chance. Will the saloon's ashes reveal justice or bury them both forever? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more through the hazy light of his lantern. Carl Boone stared at the wooden trapdoor nestled between the broken floorboards. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he gripped the iron ring pull. Behind him, Samson shifted uneasily, his hooves clattering on the warped floor. "Easy there, boy," Carl murmured, his voice barely above a whisper in the musty silence. The setting sun cast long shadows through the broken windows, painting strange patterns across the debris-strewn floor of his newly purchased saloon. The iron ring was cold against his calloused palm. With a deep breath, Carl pulled the trap door. Groaned in protest, years of disuse evident in its rusty hinges. A cloud of dust billowed up, making him cough and wave his free hand before his face. As the dust settled, the beam of his lantern revealed a set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. The damp, earthy smell grew stronger, mixing with the mustiness of long-closed spaces. Carl wrinkled his nose, reminded of root cellars and mine shafts he'd known in younger days. Samson whinnied softly, pawing at the floor with one hoof. The horse's unease matched the flutter in Carl's stomach. He'd bought this broken-down saloon, hoping it might somehow turn his fortunes around, but he hadn't expected anything like this. "Reckon we ought to see what's down there," he said, more to steady his own nerves than to inform his four-legged companion. The crowd's jeers from the auction still rang in his ears. Their doubt and derision fuel for his determination now. Carl lifted the lantern higher, examining the stairwell. The steps appeared solid enough, though time had not been kind to them. Moisture had warped some of the boards, but the main supports looked sturdy. He tested the first step with his boot, putting his weight on it gradually. The wood creaked, but held firm. Encouraged, Carl began his descent, one careful step at a time. The lantern light caught cobwebs in its beam, and the air grew cooler with each step down. Behind him, Samson's worried nickering faded as Carl moved deeper underground. At the bottom of the stairs, Carl found himself in a surprisingly large space. The basement stretched out before him, its dimensions hidden in the shadows beyond his lantern's reach. The earthen walls were shored up with thick wooden beams, the craftsmanship speaking of careful planning rather than hasty construction. "Well, I'll be," he whispered, sweeping the lantern in a slow arc. The light revealed stacks of wooden crates, pushed against the walls, their surfaces thick with dust. Old barrels lined one corner, their metal bands rusty but intact. This was no simple storage cellar. It had been built with purpose. Carl moved closer to examine one of the crates. His boots left clear prints in the dust coating the packed earth floor. The wood of the crate was solid oak, weather-sealed with pitch around the edges. No markings adorned its surface, just smooth wood and time-gathered dust. Working his fingers under the lid, Carl pried it open with a grunt of effort. The nails holding it shut had grown stubborn with age, but they finally gave way. Inside, nestled in straw padding, lay rows of glass bottles, their contents dark against the lantern light. Lord above, Carl breathed, lifting one of the bottles carefully. He wiped away decades of dust with his sleeve, revealing the amber liquid within. The label, though faded, still bore legible text. This was fine Kentucky bourbon. And from the date stamped on the label, it had been sitting here since before the war above him. Samson's hooves clattered again on the floorboards, reminding Carl he wasn't alone. The sound echoed oddly in the underground space, emphasizing its size. He moved deeper into the basement, discovering more crates and barrels. All carefully arranged and preserved, the far wall held a surprise. A heavy door made of thick planks, bound with iron. It was secured with a padlock larger than Carl's fist, the metal dark with age, but still solid. Whatever lay beyond that door would have to remain a mystery for now. Carl's mind raced with possibilities. This wasn't just a lucky find. It was a fortune in well-aged spirits, preserved perfectly, in the cool, dark space. The kind of bourbon that gentlemen in fancy clubs back east would pay dearly to taste. The sort of discovery that could turn a broken-down saloon into something special. He set the bottle back in its crate with reverent care. The jeering crowd at the auction hadn't known what lay beneath their feet. Their mockery of his purchase now seemed like providence rather than foolishness. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, the first real smile. He'd felt in longer than he cared to remember. Moving back toward the stairs, Carl noticed something else. Built into one wall was a small shelf, and on it sat a leather-bound book. He picked it up carefully, its pages stiff with age. It appeared to be some sort of ledger, though he'd need better light to read its faded entries. The basement had one final surprise in store. As Carl turned to leave, his lantern light caught something metallic gleaming in a corner. Investigating? Closer, he found a set of tools, hammers, saws, and other carpentry implements, all of good quality despite their age. These would prove invaluable in repairing the saloon above. Climbing back up the stairs, Carl emerged into the main room, where Samson waited patiently. The horse's ears perked forward at his approach, and Carl patted his neck reassuringly. Through the broken windows, the last rays of sunset painted the sky in deep purples and golds. "Looks like the Lord ain't finished with us yet, old friend," Carl said softly, scratching behind Samson's ears. The horse leaned into his touch, seemingly relieved to have his master back on solid ground. Carl secured the trapdoor, carefully marking its location in his mind. He'd need to repair the floorboard that had given way under Samson's hoof, but that could wait until tomorrow. For now, he had much to think about and plan. Moving to the saloon's front porch, Carl settled on the steps, Samson ground-tied nearby. The evening air was cooling rapidly, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. He pulled out the ledger he'd found, opening it carefully in the last light of day. As darkness settled over the town, Carl sat lost in thought, the ledger open on his knee. What had seemed like desperation this morning, buying this broken-down saloon, now felt like the hand of Providence. There was work ahead, hard work, but for the first time in years. He felt the stirring of real hope in his chest. Samson nickered softly in the gathering dusk, and Carl looked up at his faithful companion. "Reckon we'd better find ourselves a place to bed down for the night," he said, rising stiffly. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, the discovery of the hidden basement and its contents was enough to ponder. The lantern's glow cast uncertain shadows as Carl lowered it carefully through the trapdoor. The flame wavered, throwing dancing shapes against the earthen walls below. Above him, Samson's hooves clattered nervously on the wooden floor, the horse's worried nickering echoing in the empty saloon. "Easy there, old friend," Carl called up. "Softly, won't be but a minute down here." He descended the creaking steps one at a time, holding the lantern before him. The basement air hung thick with dust and something else, a bitter scent that reminded him of campfire ashes. It was smaller than he'd first thought, with rough-hewn beams supporting the ceiling and walls lined with empty shelves, cobwebs draped. The corners like tattered lace. The space felt cramped after the openness above. And Carl had to duck his head to avoid the low beams. His boots left clear prints in the dust coating the packed earth floor. He was about to turn back, disappointed, at finding nothing but an empty cellar, when a slight movement in the shadows caught his eye. There, in the furthest corner, something shifted. Carl raised the lantern higher, and his breath caught in his throat. A child crouched, their young girl with long dark hair, her eyes wide with fear like a trapped animal. She had wrapped herself in what looked like an old blanket, its edges torn and dirty. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old. Carl took an instinctive step backward, his heel hitting the bottom step. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. The girl pressed herself further into the corner, but her eyes never left his face. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am Lucy." The words trembled in the air between them. Carl could see she was trying to be brave, but fear made her whole body shake like an aspen leaf in the wind. He stayed where he was, making sure to keep his movements slow and gentle. "I'm Carl Boone," he said softly. "I won't hurt you, Lucy. Can you tell me what you're doing down here?" Lucy clutched her blanket tighter, but something in Carl's tone seemed to reach her. "Soldiers came," she said, her voice catching. "They burned our camp. A mother, she stopped, swallowing hard. She told me to run. To hide, not to let them find me." The words hit Carl like a physical blow. He'd heard whispers of cavalry units attacking Apache camps, but hearing it from this child's lips made it terribly real. Looking at her more closely now, he could see how thin she was, her cheekbones sharp beneath her skin. Dark circles shadowed. Her eyes, speaking of exhaustion and too many nights without proper rest. "How long have you been down here?" he asked gently. Lucy shook her head. "Many days, I don't know how many." Carl's throat tightened. She must have been surviving on whatever. She could scavenge, hiding in this dank basement all alone. Without thinking, he reached for the canteen at his hip. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "It's just water." Lucy stared at the canteen, conflict clear on her face. Thirst warred with caution in her eyes. Finally, slowly, she reached out and took it, though she kept as much distance between them as possible. She drank carefully at first, then more deeply as her thirst took over. "Thank you," she whispered, handing it back. Above them, Samson whinnied again, the sound making Lucy flinch. Carl glanced up at the trapdoor, then back at the girl. He couldn't leave her here that much was clear as sunrise. She needed food, proper rest, and care. "I'm going up to get some food from my saddlebags," he told her. "Would you like to come up where it's warmer? This basement's no place for anyone to sleep." Lucy hesitated, her eyes darting to the trapdoor. "The soldiers? No soldiers here," Carl assured her. "Just me and my horse Samson, and we'll hear anyone coming long before they get close." After what seemed like an eternity, Lucy nodded. Carl climbed the stairs first, giving her space to follow at her own pace. He heard her soft footsteps behind him, cautious but steady in the main room of the saloon. The last light of day filtered through the broken windows. Lucy emerged from the trapdoor like a shadow, her movements quick and wary. She glanced around the empty room, tensing at every sound from outside. Samson regarded the newcomer with gentle curiosity, his ears pricked forward. To Carl's surprise, Lucy showed no fear of the big horse. She even reached out tentatively to touch his nose when he stretched it toward her. Carl busied himself with his saddlebags, pulling out jerky and hard biscuit trail food, but better than nothing. He also found an apple he'd been saving, and without hesitation, he handed it to Lucy. Her eyes widened at the sight of the fresh fruit as she ate. Carl's mind raced. The townsfolk would never understand him harboring an Apache child. Some would call it treason. Others would demand he turn her over to the authorities. But looking at Lucy, this frightened, brave girl who had already lost so much, he knew he couldn't do that. The sun had set completely now, leaving only starlight filtering through the broken roof. Carl spread his bedroll near the old hearth, where the walls would block the worst of the wind. He had only one blanket, but that was an easy problem to solve. "Here," he said, tearing it in half as evenly as he could. "It's not much, but it'll keep the chill off." Lucy accepted her half of the blanket with something close to wonder in her eyes. She wrapped it around herself, adding it to her tattered one. Carl noticed she positioned herself where she could see both the front door and the windows, her back to the solid wall. As they settled down for the night, Carl sent up a silent prayer. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew in his heart he'd made the right choice. No child deserved to be alone and afraid, no matter what others might think. Lucy's breathing eventually steadied into the rhythm of sleep, though Carl noticed how light it was, ready to wake at the smallest sound. He stayed awake longer, listening to the night sounds of the prairie through the broken windows, the lonely call of a coyote, the whisper of wind through sage, and Samson's occasional soft snorts as the horse dozed on his feet. The stars wheeled slowly overhead through the gaps in the roof, and Carl thought about how life could change in an instant. This morning, he'd been a man at the end of his rope, buying a ruined building out of desperation. Now he was guardian to a child who had lost everything, choosing a path that would surely bring trouble. But looking at Lucy's sleeping form, small and vulnerable in the starlight, he knew there had never really been a choice at all. Some things a man had to do, simply because they were right. Morning light crept through the broken shutters of the old saloon, painting stripes across the warped floorboards. Carl stirred from his makeshift bed, muscles stiff from sleeping on the hard floor. He glanced over to where Lucy had curled up against the wall, relieved to see her still there. Wrapped in her half of the blanket, the girl's eyes opened the moment he moved, alert and watchful. Carl gave her a gentle nod as he stood, stretching his back. "Reckon we could both use some breakfast," he said quietly, keeping his movements slow and predictable. He dug in his saddlebags and pulled out a small iron pot and a packet of beans. "Been carrying these a while. Better to share them than eat alone." Lucy watched intently as Carl gathered bits of broken wood and built a small fire in the old hearth. The morning air was cool enough to warrant it, and the chimneys seemed sound despite the saloon's general state of disrepair. Soon, the beans were simmering, filling the dusty room with their homey smell. As they waited for the food to cook, Lucy spoke softly. "My father was a leader among our people," she said, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "He taught me the songs of our ancestors and showed me how to read the stars." Her voice caught slightly. The soldiers came at dawn. They did not listen when he tried to speak with them. Carl's heart ached at the pain in her voice. "I'm mighty sorry about what happened to your people, Lucy. No child should have to face such things." He stirred the beans, then divided them between 2 tin cups, offering one to Lucy. She accepted it with a slight bow of her head, a gesture that spoke of her upbringing. "Been meaning to clear some of this rubble," Carl said, after they had eaten, trying to give the day some sense of normalcy. "Make this place a bit more livable." He picked up a worn broom he had found propped in the corner. Lucy rose to help, gathering broken boards into neat piles while Carl swept. They worked their way steadily across the main room, the morning light growing stronger through the windows. When they reached the trapdoor to the basement, Carl paused. "Might as well give down there a proper look in the daylight," he said. Lucy nodded, following him down the creaking steps. The basement looked different in the morning light that filtered through the floorboards above. Carl noticed details he had missed in the darkness-sold barrel rings. A rusted lantern hook, and in the furthest corner, something that made him stop short. There, half buried in earths and debris, was an iron-bound chest. "Well, what have we here?" Carl murmured, moving closer. The chest was solid oak, its iron bands thick with rust but still strong. A heavy padlock secured the lid, also rusted but stubborn. Lucy came to stand beside him, her eyes wide. "I did not see this before," she whispered. "I stayed in the other corner, where the shadows were deepest." Carl retrieved his hatchet from upstairs and, after several careful attempts, managed to pry the lock free. The lid creaked open on protesting hinges. Inside, protected from dust and damp by oiled cloth, lay stacks of papers. Carl lifted them out, carefully maps, drawn with careful precision. Ledgers filled with neat columns of numbers and legal documents bearing official seals. As he read through them, his hands began to tremble. These papers told a story, one of land deals and water rights, of promises made and broken. And at the heart of it all was this very piece of land where the saloon now stood. "Lucy," he said. "Slowly, these papers, they show this land belonged to your people. There are water rights here, agreements about the creek that runs behind the property." He looked at her, understanding dawning. This land was your family's. Lucy touched one of the maps gently, tracing the lines with her finger. "My father spoke of papers that proved our rights to the water, the white men's own laws that showed the truth." Her voice grew quiet. He could not find them when they came. Carl sat back on his heels, mind racing. These documents could cause an uproar in town, proof that the land had been wrongfully taken, that the water rights still legally belonged to Lucy's people. But revealing them now could bring unwanted attention, putting Lucy in danger. The sound of boots on the boardwalk outside made them both freeze. Carl quickly gathered the papers and slid them back into the chest. "Best keep these safe for now," he whispered. Lucy nodded, already moving toward the shadows. Voices drifted down from above, followed by laughter. Carl climbed the stairs and found 3 townsmen peering through the broken windows. "Well, if it ain't Carl Boone, king of his castle," one called out. "Thought you lost your mind, buying this wreck. Ain't worth the nails holding it together." Carl forced a smile, positioning himself to block their view inside. "Reckon every man's entitled to his opinion," he said mildly. "Got work to do here, if you'll excuse me." They wandered off, still chuckling, and Carl let out a breath. He spent the rest of the morning gathering old canvas and boards, rigging a temporary patch over the worst holes in the roof. Dark clouds were building in the west, promising rain as evening approached. The patch proved its worth. Rain drummed steadily on the canvas, but the inside stayed relatively dry. Carl had built another small fire, its light casting warm shadows on the walls. Lucy sat near the hearth, her knees drawn up to her chest. Softly, almost too quiet to hear at first, she began to hum. The melody was gentle, rising and falling like wind through prairie grass. Carl paused in his work, listening. "My mother sang this to me," Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It tells of how the first rain came to the desert, bringing life to the dry places." Carl sat down quietly, not wanting to break the spell of trust that had settled in the room. The tune continued, weaving with the sound of the rain and the crackle of the fire, filling the old saloon with something that felt almost like peace. Outside, rain continued to fall, washing the dust from the windows and the years of neglect from the weathered boards. Inside, Carl watched the firelight play across Lucy's face as she hummed her mother's song, and knew that protecting her hand, the truth hidden in that iron-bound chest, was worth whatever trouble might come. The morning sun cast long shadows across the warped floorboards as Carl pulled his worn saddle from its resting place. Samson stood patient and steady, ears flicking at the familiar sound of leather and metal. Carl ran a weathered hand along the horse's flank, checking the cinch one final time. "Now, Lucy," he said softly, turning to where the girl stood in the doorway. "You stay inside, you hear? Keep away from the windows and don't make a sound, no matter who comes by." Lucy nodded, her dark eyes serious. "I will be like Shadow," she whispered, already backing into the dimness of the saloon's interior. Carl watched her disappear into the gloom before mounting Samson. The ride into town felt longer than usual, each hoofbeat echoing Carl's growing concerns. The general store sat at the far end of Main Street, its faded sign creaking in the morning breeze. As Carl rode past the other businesses, he caught snippets of conversation that fell silent at his approach, only to resume with poorly hidden laughter once he passed. "There goes old Boone, fixing to rebuild that wreck," someone called out, loud. "Enough to carry." "Might as well try sweeping back the tide," another voice answered, followed by more laughter. Carl kept his eyes forward, his jaw set. Samson's steady gait carried him past the mockers to the hitching post outside the general store. The horse's hooves kicked up little clouds of dust as Carl dismounted and secured the reins. Inside the store, the familiar smell of coffee beans and leather goods filled the air. Carl had just started filling his list: flour, salt, coffee, and nails, when the heavy tread of boots announced Sheriff Harlan's arrival. The lawman's badge caught the morning light as he positioned himself between Carl and the door. "Boone," the sheriff said, his voice carrying the false friendliness that made Carl's neck hair rise. "Quite the investment you made yesterday." Carl kept his movement steady as he measured flour into a sack. "Reckon that's my business, Sheriff." "Now see here," Harlan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "That old place ain't worth the trouble of fixing. Why don't you sell it back? Save yourself some grief. I know some folks who'd take it off your hands, pay you for the scrap even." Carl met the sheriff's gaze evenly. "Much obliged for the concern," he said carefully, "but I aim to keep what's mine." Something flickered in Harlan's eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before. He opened his mouth to respond, but Carl had already moved past him, placing his coins on the counter and gathering his supplies. The ride back seemed quicker, worry spurring Samson to a faster pace. But when Carl pushed open the saloon door, he stopped short in surprise. The floor, which had been littered with debris that morning, was now swept clean. In one corner, Lucy had arranged her blanket and the few possessions she owned, a small leather pouch and a wooden comb with careful precision. "You've been busy," Carl said softly, setting down his supplies. Lucy ducked her head, but he caught the ghost of a smile. As evening approached, Carl pulled out the flour he'd bought. "Time you learned something useful," he said, clearing space. "On an old table, my mother taught me to make biscuits when I wasn't much older than you." Lucy watched intently as Carl measured flour into a bowl, adding a pinch of salt and a spoonful of lard. He showed her how to work the dough with gentle fingers. Not too much, just until it came together. "Like this?" she asked, her small hands mimicking his movements. When Carl nodded approval, her smile grew broader. Soon the smell of baking biscuits filled the old saloon, making it feel more like a home than it had in decades. Lucy's shy pride in her first attempt at baking brought an unexpected warmth to Carl's chest. The peace was broken by the sound of footsteps on the boardwalk outside. Carl's hand moved instantly to his rifle, pushing Lucy behind him as two shadows appeared at the broken windows. The men wore city clothes, their watch chains glinting in the fading light. "Evening," one called through the window frame. "Hoping to have a word about this property?" "We represent the railroad," the other added smoothly. "It's particularly interested in any deeds or water rights you might have come across." Carl's grip tightened on his rifle. "Nothing to discuss," he said firmly. "Properties not for sale." "Now, sir?" The first man's voice hardened slightly. Surely we can come to an arrangement. This location would be ideal for our new track line. As I said, Carl's voice left no room for argument, nothing to discuss. Good evening to you. Men lingered a moment longer, their shadows dark against the twilight sky, before moving away. Their footsteps faded into the gathering night, but the tension remained. Lucy emerged from behind Carl, her face pale in the lantern light. "Will they take me away?" She whispered, voice trembling, "Like the soldiers took my people." Carl knelt down to meet her eyes, his heart heavy with the weight of promise against reality. "No," he said firmly, though uncertainty gnawed at his gut. "I won't let that happen. You're safe here." But as he spoke the words, Carl felt the true cost of that promise settling on his shoulders. The railroad meant money, and money meant power. He'd seen too many small ranchers and farmers pushed aside by that power, their protests buried under Progress's steady march. Lucy's small hand found his, squeezing gently as if she understood the burden he carried. Outside, a coyote called lonely into the darkness, and somewhere in town, a train whistle echoed back. Carl checked his rifle one more time before settling in for what promised to be a long night. The next few days settled into a steady rhythm of work and quiet companionship. Carl rose before dawn each morning, salvaging wooden boards from behind the general store and gathering fallen planks from abandoned buildings on the edge of town. Lucy watched from the doorway as he measured and cut each piece, her quick eyes learning the patterns of his work. "Could I help?" she asked on the second morning, pointing to the pile of nails scattered across his workbench. Carl smiled, handing her a tin can. "Sort these by size, longer ones for the roof, shorter ones for the walls." Lucy took to the task with careful precision, organizing the rusty nails into neat rows. When Carl climbed up to patch the roof, she handed them up one by one, her small voice calling warnings if he stepped near a weak spot in the boards. The saloon slowly transformed under their efforts. Broken windows found new glass, warped floorboards were replaced, and the worst holes in the roof disappeared beneath fresh planking. Each evening, exhausted but satisfied, they shared simple meals of beans and biscuits at the old bar Carl had cleaned and sanded smooth. Before sleeping, Carl would bow his head in prayer, speaking softly of gratitude and protection. Lucy began, joining him, first watching curiously, then folding her own hands in quiet reverence. She didn't always understand the words, but she felt their power, like the sacred songs her mother had taught her. When Sunday morning arrived, Carl hesitated over his decision. The church sat on the outskirts of town, its white steeple reaching toward heaven like a finger pointing the way. He knew taking Lucy there would stir talk, but something in his heart said it was right. "Would you like to come to church with me?" he asked over breakfast. "It's a place where we thank the Great Spirit, where we pray together with others." Lucy's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. She put on her cleanest dress, one Carl had bought from the general store, and carefully combed her long dark hair. Carl donned his Sunday shirt, the one without patches, and they walked the dusty road toward the church, heads turned as they approached. Mothers pulled children closer, and men's conversations died mid-sentence. Carl felt Lucy's small hand slip into his, trembling slightly. He squeezed it gently, leading her up the wooden steps. They sat in the back pew, where the morning light streamed through colored glass windows, painting patterns on the floor. The whispers continued, a constant rustle like wind through dry grass. But Lucy sat straight and still, her eyes fixed on the cross at the front of the church. Preacher Matthews, a tall man with kind eyes and graying hair, paused in his sermon. When he saw them, for a moment the church held its breath. Then the preacher's weathered face creased in a warm smile. "Welcome, children of God," he said, his voice carrying to every corner. All are precious in His sight. After the service, as people filed out, the preacher made his way to their pew. He knelt down to Lucy's level, his movements gentle and unhurried. "Brings joy to my heart to see new faces in God's house," he said softly. "You are welcome here, child." Lucy ducked her head shyly, but her grip on Carl's hand loosened slightly. The preacher's words seemed to break something in the air, and a few of the congregation members nodded as they passed, some even offering small smiles. That evening, Carl arranged the saloon's main room for company. He and Lucy had scrubbed the old tables clean, and fresh candles cast a warm glow over the restored portions of the room. A pot of beans simmered on the cook stove, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. The first knock came just as the sun began to set. Sarah Miller, the seamstress, arrived with her husband John and a basket of fresh-baked pies. The Anderson family followed Tom, Martha, and their 3 children, bringing a jug of fresh milk and curious smiles. Even old Widow Jenkins made her way over, leaning on her cane but bearing a plate of sugar cookies. "Land's sakes," Widow Jenkins exclaimed, looking around. "You've worked miracles with this old place, Carl Boone." The children ran their hands along the smooth-sanded bar, asking Lucy questions about helping with the repairs. She answered softly at first, then with growing confidence as they showed genuine interest in her work. After the meal, when everyone sat contentedly around the tables, Lucy stood suddenly, her voice clear and pure, lifted in song, an Apache hymn her mother had taught her. The haunting melody filled every corner of the room, speaking of stars and wind, of the Great Spirit's love for all His children. The adults sat transfixed, their faces softening in the candlelight. Martha Anderson wiped tears from her eyes, and John Miller nodded slowly, as if understanding something beyond words. The children sat still for the first time that evening, caught in the spell of Lucy's voice. When the last note faded, silence held for a long moment. Then Widow Jenkins spoke, her voice rough with emotion. "That was surely a gift from heaven, child." The others murmured agreement, and Lucy's shy smile lit up her entire face. Carl watched as the neighbors who had come out of curiosity began treating Lucy like any other child, offering her cookies and asking about her singing. As the evening drew to a close, the guests gathered their empty plates and baskets. Each one thanked Carl for the hospitality, but more importantly, each one acknowledged Lucy, a pat on the shoulder, a warm smile, a word of praise for her song. When the last guest had gone, Lucy helped Carl clear the tables, her movements light and almost dancing. "Thank you," she said suddenly, stopping to look up at him. "I feel safe here now, like home." Carl's throat tightened with emotion. He moved to the hearth, kneeling for his evening prayers. The familiar words came easily tonight, filled with gratitude for this unexpected blessing. Lucy knelt beside him, her small form a reminder of God's mysterious ways. One by one, Carl extinguished the lanterns, leaving only the dying embers of the hearth to light the room. Outside, crickets sang their evening chorus, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage through the repaired windows. In the peaceful darkness, Carl felt the truth of Lucy's words. This broken-down saloon had indeed become a home. Blessed by God's grace and the power of acceptance, the morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when thunderous pounding shook the saloon's front door. Carl jolted awake, his heart hammering. Lucy, who had been stoking the breakfast fire, froze like a startled deer. "Open up, Boone." Sheriff Harlan's voice boomed through the wooden door. "Official business." Carl caught Lucy's eye and motioned urgently toward the basement trapdoor. She understood immediately, gathering her blanket and moving silently across the floor. The pounding continued as Carl helped her lift the heavy door. "Just a minute," Carl called out, making sure Lucy was safely below before closing the trapdoor and sliding a crate over it. He straightened his suspenders and ran a hand through his hair before opening the front door. "Sheriff." Harlan stood flanked by 2 deputies, their badges gleaming in the morning light. The sheriff's face was set in hard lines, his gray eyes cold. Beneath the brim of his hat, "Step aside, Boone," Harlan ordered. "We've had reports of suspicious activity. Got a warrant to search the premises." Carl's mouth went dry, but he kept his voice steady. "Suspicious activity. I've been doing honest repair work, Sheriff. Nothing more. We'll see about that." Harlan shouldered past him, deputies following close behind. Their boots echoed on the newly repaired floorboards as they spread out through the saloon. Carl watched tensely as they overturned his bedroll, rifled through his tools, and peered behind stacked lumber. Deputy Wilson kicked over a bucket of nails, sending them scattering across the floor. The other deputy, Matthews, poked his rifle barrel into dark corners and behind the bar. "Check upstairs," Harlan ordered, his eyes never leaving Carl's face. The deputies clomped up the narrow stairs, their heavy footfalls sending dust sifting down from the ceiling beams. "Someone's been cooking here regular," Harlan observed, gesturing to the still warm cook stove. "Lot of food for one man." "Hard work makes a man hungry," Carl replied evenly, though his palms were sweating. He sent up a silent prayer that Lucy would stay quiet below. The deputies returned, shaking their heads. "Nothing up there but broken. Beams and bird nests, Sheriff." Harlan's jaw tightened. He stepped closer to Carl, close enough that Carl could smell tobacco on his breath. "Listen here, Boone. We know what you're about. Harboring runaways carries consequences in this territory, serious ones." "I'm not harboring anyone," Carl said firmly. "Just trying to make something of this place, like any honest man would." "We'll be watching," Harlan warned. "One slip, one proof you're lying, and you'll find yourself in my jail." He adjusted his gun belt meaningfully. "Come on, boys." Carl stood in the doorway until they mounted up and rode away, their horses kicking up dust in the morning light. Only then did he hurry to the trapdoor, his hands shaking slightly as he moved the crate. Lucy's face was pale in the shadows below, but she climbed out steadily. Without a word, she went to gather the scattered nails, sorting them by size, just as he'd taught her. "Someone must have seen you at church," Carl said quietly, joining her on the floor. A toss told the sheriff. Lucy's small hands stilled over the nails. "Am I?" She hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. "Am I a burden to you? Burden to you?" Carl's heart clenched. He set down his handful of nails and turned to face her fully. "Lucy, look at me." He waited until she raised her eyes to his. "You're not a burden. You're family now. God brought you to me for a reason, and I aim to honor." That tears welled in her dark eyes, but she nodded, managing a small smile. They spent the rest of the morning working side by side, neither mentioning the sheriff's visit again. Several days passed in relative peace. Carl and Lucy fell into a routine of repairs and cooking, prayers, and quiet conversations. But their respite was broken one evening by the return of the railroad men. They arrived just before sunset, their expensive boots and clean suits standing out against the dusty street. Carl recognized them from their previous visit, Harrison and Weber from the railway company. "Evening, Mr. Boone," Harrison said smoothly, removing his hat. "Might we have a word?" Carl noticed Lucy slip quietly upstairs, out of sight but within hearing range. He gestured the men inside, staying near the door himself. "Place is looking better," Weber observed, running a gloved hand along the freshly sanded bar. "You've put in good work here. We'll cut to the chase," Harrison said. "Railway's prepared to offer you twice what you paid at auction. Cash money, right now." He pulled out a leather wallet, thick with bills. Carl's throat tightened at the sight of so much money, but he shook his head. Not interested in selling. Harrison's friendly smile faltered. "Mr. Boone, surely you understand the railway's coming through here, whether folks like it or not. Better to profit from progress than stand in its way." "The saloon's not for sale," Carl repeated firmly. "At any price." Weber stepped forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Accidents happen to stubborn men, Boone, especially out here where help's far away. Buildings catch fire. Horses go lame. Men disappear." Carl straightened to his full height, though his heart was pounding. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Weber?" "Just stating facts." Weber replied with a cold smile. "Think on our offer. We'll be back." After they left, Carl spent the evening on the roof, methodically checking and tightening every board. The physical work helped calm his nerves, though. He kept scanning the street for signs of trouble. The smell of baking bread drew him down as darkness fell. Lucy stood at the wooden counter, kneading dough with sure movements. A lantern cast her shadow large against the wall, making her seem taller than her 12 years. They ate their simple supper in companionable quiet, sharing fresh bread and the last of the beans. After the dishes were cleared, Carl pulled out his worn Bible. "There's something I want to share with you," he said, turning the pages carefully. "Here it is. Psalm 68, verse 5. Father of the fatherless and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation." Lucy listened intently as he explained the verse's meaning. Then she repeated it back, her voice soft but filled with quiet conviction. Father of the fatherless and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. "That's right," Carl said warmly. "God watches over those who seem alone in the world, and he sends people to help care for them too." Lucy nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. Together, they sat in the lantern's glow, two souls brought together by Providence, finding strength in ancient words of comfort and protection. The midweek sun beat down on the half-repaired saloon as Carl worked steadily, hammering new shingles into place. Below, Lucy swept the wooden porch with sure strokes, humming softly to herself. Her thin frame had filled out some over the weeks of regular meals, and color had returned to her cheeks down inside. The saloon was taking shape. Fresh boards replaced rotted ones, and sunlight now streamed through clean windows instead of broken panes. The bar gleamed with fresh polish, and curtains Lucy had sewn from flour sacks added a homey touch, taking a break from his roofing work. Carl climbed down and settled on the porch steps, wiping sweat from his brow. Lucy brought him a tin cup of water, then sat beside him, her dark eyes thoughtful. "Tell me about her," she asked quietly. "Your wife?" Carl's hands tightened on the cup. It had been years since anyone had asked about Sarah. She was, he cleared his throat, she was kind, always seeing the good in folks, even when they didn't deserve it. Love to garden could make anything grow, even in this dusty soil. Lucy listened intently, her small hands folded in her lap. "Did you want children?" "We did." Carl's voice grew rough. "Sarah was carrying our first when the fever took her. I reckon God had different plans than what we hoped for." To his surprise, Lucy's hand slipped into his, squeezing gently. Her gesture of comfort touched something deep in his heart, something he'd thought long buried. They sat in understanding silence as the afternoon shadows lengthened. That evening, Carl had invited more townsfolk for supper, hoping to build on the goodwill from their last gathering. Lucy had outdone herself, baking 3 loaves of bread and a berry cobbler from wild berries she'd gathered. The aroma drew people in, filling the saloon with the buzz of conversation and occasional laughter. Preacher Matthews sat at the bar, sharing stories with Widow Jensen while her children played marbles in the corner. Even crusty old Tom Wilson had shown up, bringing a pot of his famous beef stew to share. The saloon felt alive again, like it was meant to be a gathering place for community. Lucy moved among the guests with quiet grace, refilling coffee cups and offering bread. Several of the women who'd been standoffish before now smiled at her, complimenting her baking. Carl watched from near the cook stove, his heart full. For one sweet moment, it felt like everything they'd worked for was coming together. The guests departed as night fell, leaving behind warmth and good wishes. Carl and Lucy cleaned up contentedly, storing leftover food and washing dishes by lamplight. Samson nickered softly from his corner stall, where he liked to stay close to them at night. "That went well," Carl said, hanging the last pot on its hook. "Reckon folks are starting to see what this place could be." Lucy smiled, about to respond, when a sharp crack split the night air. Orange light flared suddenly through the windows. Carl's heart stopped as he recognized the sound of flames. "Fire! Uck!" he shouted, grabbing Lucy's arm. "Out the back! Now!" Burst through the rear door into chaos. Flames were already climbing the outer walls, feeding hungrily on the fresh lumber. The heat hit them like a physical blow as Carl half-dragged Lucy away from the building. "Samson!" Lucy cried, trying to pull free. Carl ran back through the smoke, finding Samson rearing in panic. He grabbed the horse's halter, leading him out just as burning timbers began to fall. They stumbled to safety as the roof started to cave in with a thunderous roar. People were running toward the saloon now, some carrying buckets, others just coming to watch. Carl heard both calls for water and mocking laughter in the crowd. He held Lucy close as she trembled, watching their home burn. The fire brigade arrived too late to save much. Water streams hissed uselessly against the inferno as the roof collapsed completely. Carl recognized Weber and Harrison watching from the shadows, their satisfied smirks visible in the firelight before they melted away into the darkness. Through the long night, Carl, Lucy, and their few true friends fought the blaze. But by dawn, only charred beams remained standing like blackened bones against the pale sky. The chest of deeds was safe in its hiding place, but everything else, all their work, their hopes, their progress, lay in ashes. Exhausted beyond words, Carl led Lucy and Samson to a grassy spot beneath an old oak tree, well away from the smoldering ruins. He spread his singed bedroll on the ground, and Lucy sank down beside him, her face streaked with soot and tears. Samson stood guard nearby, his ears twitching at every sound, while the morning stars faded overhead. Lucy pressed close to Carl's side, shivering despite the lingering heat from the fire. "Why did they do this?" she whispered. "Why does God let bad people hurt others?" Her voice caught. Maybe he has abandoned us." Carl's throat tightened as he held back his own tears. His arms encircled Lucy's thin shoulders, drawing her close like the daughter he'd never had. "No, little one. God hasn't abandoned us. Sometimes he lets hard things happen, but he never leaves us to face them alone." He took a shaky breath. "We're family now. You and me. Whatever comes, we'll endure it together." Lucy nodded against his shoulder, her tears soaking his shirt. Above them, the stars continued their steady vigil as night slowly gave way to dawn, while the ruins of their dreams smoldered in the distance. But in the midst of loss, something stronger than timber and nails held them together. The unshakable bonds of chosen family forged in fire and faith. Dawn painted the sky in streaks of pale gold as Carl stood among the smoking ruins of the saloon. The acrid smell of burnt timber hung heavy in the air. He kicked through the ashes, heart aching at the sight of Lucy's flour sack curtains reduced to cinders, her carefully arranged sleeping corner now just charred boards. Samson watched from beneath the oak tree where Lucy still slept. Exhausted from their night of loss, the crunch of hoofbeats drew Carl's attention. Sheriff Harlan rode up on his bay horse, two deputies flanking him. The lawman's face wore a cold smile as he surveyed the destruction. "Mighty convenient fire you had here, Boone," Harlan drawled, swinging down from his saddle. "Almost like you said it yourself, hoping for some sympathy from the good folks of this town." Carl's jaw tightened. "You know that's not true, Sheriff. Someone torched my property last night." "There were witnesses." "Witnesses." Harlan cut him off with a bark of laughter. "All I see is a failed businessman who couldn't make his investment pay. And now I hear you've been harboring an Indian fugitive too." The words hit Carl like a physical blow. He glanced toward the oak tree where Lucy was now sitting up, watching with wide eyes. "She's just a child," Carl said, keeping his voice steady. "Her family was killed. She needs protection. What she needs is the proper authorities." Harlan snapped. He nodded to his deputies. "Take her." "No." Carl lunged forward as the men moved toward Lucy, but the sheriff's rifle butt caught him hard in the ribs. He stumbled, gasping for air. "Don't fight them, Lucy." He managed to call out as the deputies seized her arms. Her dark eyes met his, full of terror and resignation. They half-dragged her toward the waiting jail wagon, her feet barely touching the ground. "And those deeds you've been bragging about finding?" Harlan said, prodding Carl with his rifle. "Seems they've gone missing in the fire." "Convenient? That all?" Tried to rise, but another blow from the rifle sent him sprawling. His vision swam as rough hands hauled him up and bound his wrists. "You can't do this," he ground out through clenched teeth. "I'm the law here, Boone. I can do whatever needs doing to keep order." Harlan's voice held cold satisfaction. "Get him mounted up." The ride into town was a blur of pain and worry. Carl's ribs screamed with every hoofbeat, but his heart ached. More at the sight of Lucy in the jail wagon ahead, her small form jolting with each rut in the road. A crowd gathered as they passed, some pointing and whispering, others turning away. At the jailhouse, the deputies shoved Carl into a bare cell, the iron door clanging shut with terrible finality. Through the bars, he watched them lead Lucy down a separate hallway. "Where are you taking her?" he demanded. "None of your concern," Harlan said. "She'll be kept secure until proper authorities decide what to do with her kind." Left alone in his cell, Carl paced despite his injuries. Shadows lengthened across the floor as afternoon faded to evening. His thoughts circled endlessly. The missing deeds, Lucy's fear, the ruins of all they'd built. When darkness finally fell, he sank to his knees on the cold stone floor. "Why, Lord?" he whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears. "Why give me hope just to take it all away again? First Sarah, now this." His shoulders shook as grief overwhelmed him. Then, floating through the bars, came a soft, clear voice. Lucy was singing her mother's hymn, the Apache words carrying strength despite their gentleness. Carl closed his eyes, letting the melody wash over him. Though he couldn't understand the words, their meaning reached his heart. Courage, endurance, faith in something greater than their current pain. As midnight approached, moonlight striped the cell floor through the barred window. Carl sat with his back against the wall, Lucy's song still echoing in his mind. His body ached, but his spirit had steadied. God hadn't abandoned them before, and he wouldn't now. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Footsteps in the corridor made him look up. Preacher Matthews stood outside the cell, his kind face grave in the dim light. "I can't stay long," the preacher said softly. "But I wanted you to know, you're not alone in this fight." He glanced around, then quickly slipped a folded paper through the bars. "I have something to reveal when they bring you to court. Teep. Faith, brother." The preacher's footsteps faded away before Carl could respond. He unfolded the note with trembling fingers, but in the darkness he couldn't make out the words. Still, its presence in his pocket felt like a lifeline, a reminder that not everyone had turned against them. From down the hall, Lucy's voice rose again in song, softer now, but undefeated. Carl leaned his head back against the rough stone wall, adding his own quiet prayer to her melody. Together, their voices lifted into the night, carrying hope despite their chains. Through the window, stars wheeled slowly overhead, the same stars that had watched over them beneath the oak tree, just last night when they still had a home. But home, Carl realized, wasn't the burned-out shell of the saloon. Home was the trust in Lucy's eyes when she shared her mother's songs, the warmth of her small hand in his, the strength they gave each other. That couldn't be taken away by iron bars or missing deeds. He fingered the preacher's note in his pocket, wondering what revelation it promised. But for now, it was enough to know they weren't fighting alone. Lucy's hymn drifted through the darkness like a gentle reminder. God's presence reached even here, beyond the bars and shadows, carrying them toward whatever dawn would bring. Morning. Light crept through the jail window, finding Carl already awake on his thin mattress. His ribs ached from the sheriff's blows, but worry for Lucy gnawed deeper. Heavy boots echoed down the corridor as two deputies approached his cell. "On your feet, Boone," one ordered, unlocking the door. "Court's waiting." They marched him through streets still damp with dew, past townspeople gathering to witness his shame. The courthouse loomed ahead, its wooden steps worn by years of judgments. Inside, the close air smelled of dust and polish. Carl's boots scuffed against the floorboards as the deputies led him to the defendant's table. Judge Kirison presided from his elevated bench, thin and severe in his black robes. Carl had heard whispers about the judge's railroad connections, how his brother-in-law held significant shares, how decisions always seemed to favor the company's interests. Those whispers felt heavy now as the judge's cold eyes settled on him. Sheriff. Harlan stood at the prosecutor's table, hat placed precisely before him. "Your Honor," he began, voice carrying through the packed gallery. "We bring serious charges against Carl Boone, arson of his own property for sympathy and insurance, harboring a fugitive Apache child, attempting to falsify land claims with supposedly discovered deeds that conveniently burned before examination." The sheriff's words drew mutters from the crowd. Carl's hands clenched beneath the table as Harlan continued painting him as a desperate failure, trying to save himself through fraud and sympathy. "Mr. Boone," Judge Harrison intoned when Harlan finished, "you may speak in your defense." Carl rose slowly, mindful of his injured ribs. "Your Honor, I'm a simple man who bought that property fair at auction. The fire was set by others. There are witnesses who saw strangers riding away. As for Lucy," his voice softened, "she's an orphaned child who needed help. Her mother was killed when soldiers burned their camp. The deeds we found prove her family's rightful claim to that land lies." Harlan interrupted. "Convenient stories. Without proof, now that the alleged documents are destroyed." "Order," Judge Harrison warned, though his stern gaze remained fixed on Carl. "Continue, Mr. Boone." "Those deeds existed, Your Honor. They showed the property was sold legally to Lucy's father years ago. The water rights, enough." The judge's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "You offer no evidence beyond your word, Mr. Boone. Where is this child now?" At his signal, the rear doors opened. Lucy entered between two deputies, her dark eyes wide, but chin lifted brave. She wore the same dress from the fire, now smudged with soot and jail dust. Carl's heart twisted at her obvious fear. Though she walked straight back to the front, the prosecutor rose, a tall man with hard eyes. "Your Honor, this is clearly an Apache orphan who should be remanded to the reservation authorities. Her presence here is disruptive to proper order. I move that, if it please the court." The quiet voice cut through the prosecutor's demands. In the gallery, Preacher Matthews stood, his weathered face grave as he clutched an envelope. The elderly minister made his way forward, each step deliberate on creaking floorboards. "Your Honor, I have testimony relevant to this case." Judge Harrison frowned. "This is a regular preacher." However, he gestured impatiently. "Proceed." The preacher approached the bench, his gray head bowed respectfully. 20 years ago, I performed a marriage ceremony between two people running river, a respected Apache leader and Sarah Martinez, daughter of the Spanish trader. They built a life together, including purchasing the Saloon property through legal channels. He held up the envelope. I have here the original letter they wrote, asking me to officiate their union. It references their plans to buy that land for their future children. His kind eyes found Lucy. I remember blessing their marriage and later blessing their newborn daughter. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Carl saw shock flash across the judge's face before his stern mask returned. Sheriff Harlan half rose, sputtering, but the preacher continued steadily. I witnessed their ownership of that land, Your Honor. The deeds Carl Boone claims to have found would only confirm what I already know to be true. That property rightfully belongs to their daughter, to Lucy. The judge's fingers drummed against his bench. Carl held his breath, watching the internal struggle play across the older man's face. The law was clear about legal marriages and inheritance rights, yet railroad interests pressed heavy. This complicates matters, Judge Harrison said finally. The court requires time to examine this new evidence. We will recess until proper documentation can be obtained from territorial records. His gavel struck. The defendant will return to jail during deliberations, and the girl, Sheriff Harlan demanded. The judge paused, then spoke carefully. Given these circumstances, I grant temporary custody to Preacher Matthews until this matter is resolved. Court is adjourned. Relief flooded Carl as deputies led him away. Through the shuffle of departing spectators, he caught Lucy's eye. She stood close to the preacher, managing a tiny smile that carried worlds of courage. At least she would be safe with the kind minister and his wife. Back in his cell, Carl sank onto the thin mattress, ribs protesting. The day's events tumbled. Through his mind, the judge's reluctant acknowledgement, Harlan's frustrated rage, but most of all, the preacher's unexpected testimony. God truly worked in mysterious ways, preserving evidence of Lucy's heritage through the old minister's memories. And letters. Evening shadows lengthened across his cell floor. From somewhere in town, church bells told the hour. Carl closed his eyes, picturing Lucy safe in the preacher's home. Perhaps helping Mrs. Matthews with supper, as she had helped him. The delay chafed his spirit, but he felt God's hand uneven. This setback. Truth took time to grow, like seeds pushing through soil toward light. His lips moved in quiet prayer, giving thanks for the day's small victories and asking strength for whatever tomorrow might bring. Lucy's hymn rose in his memory, its melody carrying hope even here between iron bars. They were not defeated, only waiting for God's timing to reveal the full truth of their cause. This delay was not denial. Carl reminded himself as night settled. Over the jail. The preacher's testimony had forced even a railroad-backed judge to acknowledge Lucy's legitimate claim. God had preserved proof of her parents' marriage and their dreams for her future. Now they must trust His providence through this season of waiting, believing that justice would finally prevail. Moonlight cast iron bar shadows across Carl's thin jail mattress. Sleep eluded him as he tossed and turned, his mind churning with worry. Every creak of the building, every distant hoofbeat made him wonder about Lucy's safety. The cell felt smaller with each passing hour. "Ain't looking good for you, Boone." Deputy Walker's voice carried from down the corridor. He approached with slow, deliberate steps, boots clicking against the wooden floor. Railroad always gets what it wants round here. Carl sat up, his back against the rough wall. "The Lord's justice is bigger than any railroad, Deputy." Walker snorted, adjusting his gun belt. "Tell that to the last 3 farmers who tried fighting the company. One's buried out past Boot Hill, other 2 left with nothing but saddle sores and broken dreams. I reckon those men didn't have proof of legal ownership," Carl replied quietly. "Papers burn mighty easy." Deputy Morris joined them, carrying a tin cup of coffee that he purposefully sipped in front of Carl's cell. Preachers. Testimony won't mean much once certain parties start spreading the right kind of influence. Carl closed his eyes, letting their taunts wash over him like rain off a tin roof. Their words carried poison, but he wouldn't let it seep into his spirit. Instead, he pictured Lucy safe at the preacher's house, remembering her brave smile in the courtroom. Across town, in the modest white parsonage beside the church, Lucy stood in Mrs. Matthews' kitchen. Her hands were dusted with flour as she helped the preacher's wife prepare biscuits for supper. The familiar motions reminded her of evenings with Carl, learning to cook in their half-restored saloon. "You're a natural at this, dear Mrs. Matthews," said warmly, showing Lucy how to cut the dough into perfect circles. Lucy managed a small smile, though her hands trembled slightly. "Carl taught me about biscuits," he said. Her voice caught. "He said we were family now." Mrs. Matthews paused in her work, laying a gentle hand on Lucy's shoulder. "And so you are, child. The Lord brings families together in mysterious ways. Sometimes, but what if they send me away?" The fear that had been gnawing at Lucy's heart spilled out. "The sheriff, the judge, they don't want me here." "Now you listen," Mrs. Matthews said firmly, kneeling to meet Lucy's eyes. "My husband didn't speak up in that courtroom just to have his words ignored. We're praying for you and Carl, and we're not alone." Outside the parsonage windows, raised voices carried from the street. Lucy crept to look, seeing clusters of townspeople gathered in heated discussion. Mr. Peterson, the blacksmith, jabbed his finger at Mr. Turner, the banker. "It ain't right." Peterson's voice boomed. Man Boone's done nothing but honest work, trying to give an orphan child a home. Where's the crime in that?" "The crime is disrupting progress," Turner shot back, his suit coat gleaming in the afternoon. "Son, that railroad spur means prosperity for this whole town. If you want to sacrifice that for one Apache girl, I want to honor what's legal and right." Peterson's apprentice joined in. "Them deeds belong to her family fair and square." The argument drew more participants, splitting the crowd into opposing sides. Some nodded vigorously at Peterson's words, while others clustered around Turner, muttering about progress and profit. The tension crackled like heat lightning on a summer evening. Lucy stepped back from the window, wrapping her arms around herself. Mrs. Matthews guided her gently back to the kitchen. "Don't you fret about them," the older woman soothed. "Keep your mind on these biscuits. Work in prayer. That's what sees us through hard times." As afternoon shadows lengthened, Preacher Matthews made his way to the jail, carrying a covered basket. The deputies gave him suspicious looks, but allowed him to visit Carl's cell. The old minister's face was grave as he passed Carl a plate of his wife's cooking. "How are they treating you, son?" he asked quietly. Carl accepted the food gratefully. "Well enough. How's Lucy?" "Safe and helping Martha in the kitchen." The preacher settled onto a wooden stool outside the cell. "She's a brave child, but frightened. Keeps asking about you." "Tell her I'm holding to my promise," Carl said. "I won't let them send her away." The preacher nodded, then lowered his voice. "The town's divided, Carl. Railroad money talks loud. But there are good folks speaking up for justice too. Mr. Peterson nearly came to blows with Turner over it today." "I never meant to cause such trouble," Carl sighed. "Sometimes doing right stirs up the mud at the bottom of the pond." The preacher reached through the bars to grip Carl's shoulder. "Shall we pray together, brother?" Carl knelt by the cell door, the preacher's weathered hands clasping his through the iron bars. Their quiet words rose together, asking for wisdom, protection, and justice. The familiar rhythm of prayer steadied Carl's spirit, even as the preacher's grave tone confirmed the seriousness of their situation. After the minister left, the afternoon crawled by like a wounded creature. Carl paced his cell, 7 steps each way, until his legs ached. The deputies changed shifts, bringing fresh taunts about railroad lawyers arriving from the territorial capital. Evening drew its purple curtain across the sky, but darkness wasn't far behind. The first distant rumble of thunder made the jail windows rattle. Carl stood at the tiny opening, watching clouds massed on the horizon like an army gathering for battle. The storm rolled closer, each thunderclap louder than the last. Wind kicked up dust in the street, sending townspeople hurrying for shelter. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the courthouse in stark white flashes. The building stood stern and silent, holding secrets that would determine both his and Lucy's fate. Carl sank to his knees in the darkness of his cell. The cold floor pressed against his legs, but he barely noticed. All his fears for Lucy, for himself, for their future, he laid them before the Lord like offerings. The storm's fury matched the tumult in his heart, yet somehow its wild voice brought comfort. "Your will be done," he whispered, remembering Lucy's soft hymn. "In your time, not mine." Lightning flared again, throwing cell-bar shadows across his bowed head. The courthouse windows blazed briefly in answering light, then plunged back into darkness. Thunder crashed overhead like heaven's own gavel, while rain began to drum against the jail's tin roof. Carl remained on his knees, surrendering to whatever path God had prepared. Through the storm's din, he thought he heard Lucy's hymn, carried on the wind like a promise of hope yet to come. Whether it was memory or miracle hardly mattered. The melody reminded him that even in this cold cell, he wasn't truly alone. The storm raged on, matching the tension building in the town below. But in his cell, Carl found a pocket of peace, trusting that the same God who guided him to Lucy would see them through this valley of uncertainty. Tomorrow would bring its own trials, but for now he rested in the eye of the storm, anchored by faith in something greater than railroad money or human justice. The storm unleashed its fury through the night. Rain hammered against the jails, tin roof like 1,000 angry fists, while wind howled through every crack and crevice. Carl huddled on his thin mattress, pulling the rough blanket tighter against the damp chill that seeped through the stone walls. Water dripped steadily from a leak in the corner of his cell, forming a growing puddle on the floor. The steady plink 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 kept time with his prayers as darkness stretched toward dawn. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by thunder and the occasional shouts of deputies checking the building for leaks. Morning arrived gray and sodden. The storm had turned the town's dirt streets into rivers of mud. Through his cell window, Carl watched townspeople splash through knee-deep water, holding newspapers over their heads. The courthouse clock struck 8, then 9, but no one came to fetch him for the proceedings. "Court's delayed," a deputy announced, sloshing through with coffee. "Streets are flooded clean up to the courthouse steps. Judge can't even get his buggy through." Carl nodded silently, his stomach growling. The deputy didn't offer breakfast, just smirked and moved on. The morning crawled by like a wounded animal, marked only by the steady drip of water and distant thunder. Just past noon, familiar voices drifted down the corridor. Carl's heart lifted as Lucy appeared with Mrs. Matthews, both carrying covered baskets. The preacher's wife spoke quietly with the guards while Lucy hurried to Carl's cell. "We brought you real food," she whispered, slipping warm biscuits through the bars. Steam rose from them, carrying the scent of butter and honey. "Mrs. Matthews showed me how to make them just like you taught me." Carl took the biscuits gratefully, noticing how Lucy's eyes searched his face for signs of distress. Despite her own fears, she was trying to be strong for him. The thought squeezed his heart. "These smell even better than mine," he said, managing a smile. "You're becoming quite the cook." Lucy pressed closer to the bars, lowering her voice. "I'm not afraid anymore, Carl. God brought you to find me in that basement for a reason. I know. He won't let them separate us now." Carl swallowed hard past the lump in his throat. Here was this child who had lost so much, offering him comfort in his darkness. "Lucy, listen to me," he said softly. "You're no burden. Never think that. You're a blessing straight from God's hands. Whatever happens in that courthouse, nothing changes that truth." Tears welled in Lucy's eyes, but she blinked them back bravely. "We're family now," she whispered. "That's what you said, and I believe it." "That's enough visiting," a guard barked, making Lucy jump. "Move along now." Mrs. Matthews gathered Lucy close, nodding reassuringly to Carl. "We're all praying, Brother Boone. The Lord hasn't brought you this far to leave you now." As they turned to go, Lucy glanced back one last time. The trust in her eyes stayed with Carl long after their footsteps faded away. He ate the biscuits slowly, savoring each bite, tasting love and hope in the simple offering. The afternoon dragged on, punctuated by distant thunder and the splash of horses through flooded streets. Carl dozed fitfully on his cot as evening approached. In his dreams, he saw Sarah, his late wife, standing in a sunlit field. She wore the blue dress she'd loved, her honey-colored hair caught by the breeze. Beside her stood Lucy, both of them, smiling at him with such warmth it made his chest ache. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper on the wind, "You've found your way back to joy, my love. Don't let fear steal it away." Carl woke with tears on his cheeks, but his heart felt lighter. The rain had finally stopped. Moonlight filtered through the window, painting silver stripes across his cell floor. In that quiet moment, peace settled over him like a familiar blanket. He could hear deputies moving about, their boots squeaking on wet floors. Their voices carried mentions of court preparations for morning. The storm had delayed justice, but couldn't stop its coming. Carl rose from his cot and went to the window, seeing stars peeking through breaks in the clouds. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, "for sending Lucy to remind me of your faithfulness. Whatever tomorrow brings, help me be worthy of her trust." The night passed slowly, but Carl slept better than he had since his arrest. When dawn painted the sky in pale pink and gold, he was already awake, praying quietly by his cell window. The streets had begun to drain, though mud still caked every surface. Boot steps approached down the corridor. Keys jangled as deputies came to fetch him for court. Carl stood tall, straightening his wrinkled shirt as best he could. Lucy's words echoed in his heart. God had brought them together for a reason. Whatever happened in that courthouse, there, Bonda's family was sealed by something stronger than paper or law. The cell door creaked open. Two deputies stepped in, shackles ready. "Time to go, Boone," one said gruffly. "Judge is waiting." Carl held out his wrists, calm despite the cold iron closing around them. Through the window, he could see the sun breaking through clouds, its light turning mud puddles to gold. A new day was dawning, carrying all their hopes with it. The deputies took his arms, leading him toward whatever justice awaited. But Carl walked with his head high, strengthened by Lucy's faith and the memory of Sarah's smile. In his heart, he knew whatever the outcome, love had already won its victory. The courtroom fell silent as Preacher Matthews stepped forward, clutching not only his worn letter, but bringing forward 3 elderly townspeople. Each testified clearly, remembering the day Lucy's parents were married and how they had rightfully purchased the Saloon land. "I was there," Mrs. Henderson declared, her voice steady. "Saw the whole exchange of deeds and money myself." The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, knowing he was cornered by truth. With visible reluctance, he picked up his gavel. "The court finds the land claim valid. Mr. Boone is cleared of all charges." Sheriff Harlan's face turned purple with rage. He slammed his hat on the desk and stormed toward the door, muttering dark threats under his breath. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Lucy broke free from Mrs. Matthews' grip and ran to Carl, tears streaming down her face. He wrapped his arms around her, his own eyes wet with gratitude. Outside, the railroad men mounted their horses and rode away, their scheme in ruins. Carl looked skyward, whispering thanks to God. Together, he and Lucy walked through their scorched saloon, Samson greeting them with a gentle nicker. The future was uncertain, but they faced it unafraid. The next morning, wagons creaked into the saloon yard, loaded with fresh-cut timber and crates of nails. Men who had once mocked Carl now stood with heads bowed, offering their hands and tools to help rebuild. Women brought baskets of cornbread and stewed beans, laying out a makeshift dinner on planks and sawhorses. Lucy knelt in the soft earth by the front steps, carefully planting marigold seedlings Mrs. Matthews had brought. Her small fingers patted the soil with gentle care, as if blessing each flower. Carl watched her while hauling boards with Thomas Green, his heart full at the sight. As evening approached, more families arrived, bearing lanterns that dotted the yard like earthbound stars. Their voices rose in hymns that echoed off the half-built walls. The preacher stood on newly laid floorboards, sprinkling holy water and asking God's blessing on the foundation. "This place will be for all of us now," he declared. A house of peace and unity. Children played tag around the construction while Lucy watched with shining eyes, finally part of something larger than her grief. Near the water trough, Samson grazed peacefully, his old scars visible in the fading light, but his spirit unbroken, much like the people gathered here. Carl leaned against a fresh-cut beam, overcome with gratitude. The saloon that had once drawn sneers was transforming into something beautiful. A symbol of healing for the whole town. Lamplight spilled through polished windows onto the fresh-painted walls of the restored saloon. Inside, settler families in Sunday best sat shoulder to shoulder, with Apache guests in traditional dress. The wooden pews, built by loving hands, creaked softly as people settled in. Carl straightened his collar, glancing at Lucy beside him in her new calico dress. Her eyes shone with quiet joy as the preacher took his place at the front. "Friends," the preacher began, "we gather to witness God's power to transform ruin into redemption." His words rang true against the gleaming rafters. When Lucy stood to sing her mother's hymn, other voices joined Apache and settler alike, till the melody filled every corner. Carl blinked back tears, remembering darker days when he'd stood alone in these ruins. After the service, neighbors clasped his hand warmly. Outside in the cool evening air, Carl gazed at his transformed saloon, now alive with fellowship and song. Lucy's small hand slipped into his while Samson dozed nearby, ever faithful. "Thank you, Lord," Carl whispered, "for making beauty from ashes. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.